What happens when Hollywood's most beloved comeback story collides with Britain's sharpest wit on live television? Tonight, Robert Downey Jr. thought he was walking into another charming chat about his latest projects. Instead, he found himself trapped in a verbal minefield where one poorly timed joke would ignite something explosive. What began as polite banter quickly spiraled into the kind of television moment that leaves audiences gasping. Graham Norton adjusted his signature colorful shirt, shuffling through his note cards with that mischievous grin that had made him Britain's most dangerous interviewer. He knew exactly what kind of evening this would be. "Ladies and gentlemen," Graham announced, "tonight we have a very special guest. He's conquered addiction, conquered Hollywood, and conquered our hearts as Iron Man. Please welcome the incomparable Robert Downey Jr." The studio erupted in thunderous applause as Robert emerged from backstage, his trademark swagger intact, arms raised in acknowledgement. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit with no tie, projecting that effortless cool that had defined his public persona for years. His smile was bright, confident, the smile of a man who had faced his demons and won. "Robert," Graham said warmly as they exchanged the customary handshake and air kisses, "absolutely wonderful to have you here." "Thank you for having me," Robert replied, his voice smooth and practiced. "Always a pleasure to be on the show that actually knows how to entertain." The audience chuckled appreciatively as Robert settled into the famous red sofa, crossing one leg over the other with casual elegance. Graham leaned back in his chair, that familiar twinkle already forming in his eyes. "So, Robert, you're here promoting your new film, but I have to say, every time you're on television these days, people can't help but marvel at your journey, from where you were to where you are now. It's quite remarkable, really." Robert's expression remained pleasant, though something flickered briefly across his face. "Well, Graham," he said carefully, "I prefer to focus on where I'm going rather than where I've been. The past is the past for a reason." Of course," Graham nodded, though his smile carried a hint of something sharper. "But surely you understand why people find it so inspiring. The comeback story of all comeback stories, from the depths of personal struggle to the heights of Hollywood success. It's almost biblical in scope." Robert shifted slightly in his seat, his smile tightening just a fraction. "I appreciate the sentiment, but I think we sometimes give too much weight to the dramatic narrative. Life isn't a movie, despite what people might think." The audience murmured softly, sensing the subtle tension beginning to build. Graham's eyes sparkled with that dangerous curiosity that had made him both beloved and feared. "Well, speaking of movies," he continued smoothly, "your portrayal of Tony Stark really did save your career, didn't it? Some might say it saved more than that. Marvel certainly took a gamble on you at a time when others wouldn't." Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "They took a calculated risk on a talented actor," he replied evenly. "Kevin Feige and Jon Favreau saw something in me that aligned with their vision. It wasn't charity, Graham. It was business." Graham chuckled, but there was an edge to it now. "Oh, I'm sure it was purely artistic merit. Though I imagine your insurance premiums were quite the topic of conversation in those early days." The words hung in the air like smoke. Robert's smile faltered for just a moment before returning, though colder now. "Insurance is always a consideration in filmmaking," he said, his tone measured but carrying a warning. Graham sensed the shift immediately, like a predator detecting weakness in prey. Robert leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a sharper quality. "You know, Graham, I came here to talk about my work, my craft, my current projects. I'm not sure why we keep circling back to ancient history." Graham's grin widened. "Ancient history? Robert, it was barely 15 years ago. In Hollywood terms, that's practically yesterday." The audience shifted uncomfortably, the playful atmosphere beginning to curdle into something more volatile. Robert's hands clasped together in his lap, his knuckles showing the faintest hint of white. "I think," he said slowly, "that some stories are better left in the past where they belong." Graham tilted his head with mock confusion. "But Robert, you've spoken about it so eloquently in other interviews. The journey, the redemption, the phoenix rising from the ashes. Surely it's fair game for discussion." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. "There's a difference between choosing to share your story and having it weaponized for entertainment." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Even the band members exchanged nervous glances as the tension mounted. Graham, however, appeared completely unfazed, his smile never wavering. "Weaponized? That's rather dramatic, don't you think? I'm simply acknowledging the elephant in the room. Robert uncrossed his legs and sat up straighter, his posture becoming more defensive. The elephant, as you put it, is something I've addressed countless times. I've been transparent about my struggles, my recovery, my growth. What more do you want from me? Graham's eyes glinted with something that might have been triumph. Oh, I don't want anything from you, Robert. I'm just curious about the man behind the comeback story. The audience sat in uncomfortable silence, watching two titans of their respective worlds circle each other like prize fighters in the early rounds. Robert's famous charm was beginning to crack under the pressure of Graham's relentless probing. His breathing had quickened slightly, though he was clearly trying to maintain his composure. You know what's interesting, Graham continued, his tone deceptively casual, is how Hollywood loves a good redemption arc. The fallen star who claws his way back to the top. It's almost as if the fall makes the comeback more valuable, more marketable. Do you ever think about that? Robert's lips pressed into a thin line. I think about staying healthy, staying focused, and doing good work. That's what matters to me now. Graham nodded thoughtfully, but his expression suggested he wasn't quite finished. Of course, staying healthy. That must be quite the daily commitment for someone with your particular challenges. The words landed like a physical blow. Robert's entire body tensed, his hands gripping the arms of the sofa. The audience held its collective breath, sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. The studio lights seemed to burn brighter, the cameras zooming in to capture every micro-expression on Robert's increasingly strained face. Graham sat back in his chair, that infuriating smile still plastered across his features, completely oblivious to, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the storm he had just unleashed. Robert's eyes flashed with something dangerous, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. My particular challenges? Is that what we're calling it now, Graham? His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, not from fear, but from barely contained fury. The audience could feel the shift, the way the air itself seemed to vibrate with tension. Graham, ever the professional provocateur, leaned forward with renewed interest. Well, I mean, let's be honest here. Recovery is an ongoing process, isn't it? One day at a time and all that. The words were delivered with such casual cruelty that even the camera operators winced. Robert's jaw worked silently for a moment, his composure hanging by the thinnest of threads. You know what, Graham? Robert said, his voice gaining strength and edge. I've sat through a lot of interviews in my career. I've dealt with skeptical journalists, hostile critics, even complete amateurs who thought they could rattle me. But this, he gestured vaguely at the host, this is something else entirely. This is cheap. The audience murmured uncomfortably, some shifting in their seats as if trying to physically distance themselves from the confrontation unfolding before them. Graham's smile never faltered, though something predatory flickered behind his eyes. Cheap? Robert, I'm simply having a conversation. If you're uncomfortable discussing your past, perhaps you should have mentioned that to your publicist. Robert let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head slowly. My publicist? You think this is about media strategy? Graham, I've been clean for over 15 years. I've rebuilt my life, my career, my relationships. I've been honest about my struggles because I thought it might help other people going through similar battles. But what you're doing right now isn't journalism, it's exploitation. Graham tilted his head with mock concern. Exploitation? That seems a bit harsh. I'm acknowledging your remarkable transformation. Surely that's a compliment. Robert's eyes narrowed to slits, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Don't insult my intelligence, Graham. We both know exactly what you're doing here. The studio had fallen completely silent except for the hum of the cameras and the faint rustle of nervous audience members. Even the band seemed frozen, their instruments forgotten as they watched the verbal sparring match escalate into something far more serious. Graham, however, appeared to be enjoying himself immensely. Robert, Graham continued with that infuriating calm, I think you might be reading too much into this. I'm simply curious about how someone maintains their sobriety in an industry notorious for its excesses. Parties, premieres, after-parties. It must be quite the minefield for someone in recovery. That was the moment Robert's famous self-control finally snapped. His face darkened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of years of pain and hard-won wisdom. You want to know about maintaining sobriety, Graham? It's about surrounding yourself with people who respect your journey, not vultures who want to pick at old wounds for cheap laughs. The audience gasped audibly at the venom in Robert's tone. Graham's eyebrows shot up in feigned surprise. Vultures? That's rather unkind, don't you think? I'm simply doing what I've always done, asking the questions everyone wants answered. Robert stood abruptly, his movement so sudden that the entire studio seemed to recoil. "No, Graham," Robert said, towering over the seated host. "What you're doing is trying to trigger someone in recovery for the entertainment of your audience. And the fact that you don't see how twisted that is tells me everything I need to know about your character." Graham's smile flickered for the first time, uncertainty creeping into his expression. "Oh, come now, Robert," Graham said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "Surely you're being a bit dramatic. This is live television. These things happen. People want authenticity, real conversation." Robert's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Authenticity? You want authentic, Graham? Here's authentic. What you're doing right now is exactly the kind of toxic behavior that drives people to use substances in the first place." The studio erupted in scattered gasps and murmurs. Some audience, Robert's outburst, or wait members began clapping uncertainly, unsure whether to support for Graham's response. The host himself seemed momentarily stunned, his usual quick wit apparently deserting him in the face of such raw honesty. Robert began pacing behind the sofa, his energy too intense to remain seated. "You sit there with your smug little smile, Graham, thinking you're so clever, so edgy, but what you're really doing is playing with someone's life, someone's recovery, for ratings. And the worst part is, you know it. You absolutely know it." Graham attempted to regain his composure, straightening in his chair and forcing his trademark grin back into place. "Robert, I think you're overreacting just a bit. This is what talk shows do. We discuss people's lives, their journeys, their experiences. It's hardly revolutionary." Robert stopped pacing and turned to face Graham directly, his eyes blazing with fury. "Overreacting? Graham, I've been in recovery for 15 years. 15 years of daily work, daily commitment, daily choice to stay clean and sober. And you think it's appropriate to make cute little jokes about it for your entertainment?" The host opened his mouth to respond, but Robert held up a hand to stop him. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Graham?" Robert continued, his voice gaining intensity with each word. "There are people watching this show right now who are struggling with addiction, people who might be thinking about getting help, or people who are early in their recovery, and what they're seeing is someone in a position of power and influence treating addiction like a punchline." The audience had gone completely silent now, hanging on Robert's every word. Even the production crew seemed transfixed by the raw emotion pouring from the usually controlled actor. Graham, for his part, appeared to be wrestling with whether to double down on his approach or attempt some form of damage control. Robert took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he tried to center himself. The studio lights felt hotter now, more oppressive, casting harsh shadows across his face. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less intense. "You see, Graham, recovery isn't a joke. It's not a quirky character trait or an interesting backstory for your interview notes. It's life and death. Literally life and death for millions of people around the world." Graham shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual confidence beginning to waver. The audience remained frozen, caught between fascination and horror at witnessing such an unfiltered moment of television. Robert continued, his words measured but cutting. "I've lost friends to addiction, Graham. Good people, talented people, people who deserved better than to become punchlines in talk show monologues." The host attempted to interject, his voice strained. "Robert, I never meant to suggest that addiction was something to mock. I was simply trying to acknowledge your incredible journey," and Robert cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Stop. Just stop right there. You don't get to backtrack now and pretend this was some noble attempt at inspiration. We both heard what you said. The audience heard what you said." The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of the confrontation as it unfolded. Robert's famous charm had been completely replaced by something raw and uncompromising. His eyes never left Graham's face as he spoke. "You made a calculated decision to poke at someone's trauma for entertainment value. That's not journalism, Graham. That's cruelty dressed up as wit." Graham's mouth opened and closed silently, his legendary quick wit apparently abandoning him when he needed it most. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Robert waited for a response that never came. Finally, Robert shook his head in disgust. "You know what the most disappointing part of all this is? I actually used to respect you." The words hit Graham like a physical blow, his face visibly paling under the studio lights. Robert continued, his voice gaining strength. I thought you were different from the tabloid vultures and scandal mongers. I thought you actually cared about your guests as human beings rather than just content for your show." The audience began to murmur among themselves, some clearly uncomfortable with the direction the interview had taken. Others seemed mesmerized by the raw honesty of Robert's words. Graham finally found his voice, though it lacked his usual confidence. "Robert, I think perhaps we should take a breath here and just trying to have a conversation." "A conversation?" Robert's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Graham, this stopped being a conversation the moment you decided to turn my recovery into your comedy material. This became something else entirely, something ugly." Graham's trademark smile had completely vanished now, replaced by an expression of genuine concern and perhaps even fear. Robert began moving toward the edge of the stage, his body language suggesting he was preparing to leave. The production crew exchanged panicked glances, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. Graham made one last desperate attempt to salvage the interview. "Robert, please, I think there's been a misunderstanding here." "Misunderstanding?" Robert spun around to face him one final time, his eyes blazing with fury. "Graham, there's no misunderstanding here. You made a conscious choice to mock someone's recovery journey on live television. You turned someone's darkest period into your entertainment. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a character flaw." The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning system. Even the band members had stopped pretending to look busy with their instruments. All eyes were focused on the confrontation playing out in front of them. Graham made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "Robert, I genuinely apologize if my words came across as insensitive. That was never my intention. I have nothing but admiration for your journey and your success in overcoming such significant challenges." Robert's expression didn't soften at the apology. Instead, he seemed to grow even more frustrated. "Your intention? Graham, impact matters more than intention. You can't wound someone and then hide behind your good intentions. The damage is already done. The words are already out there. And somewhere tonight, someone struggling with addiction is going to see this and think that their recovery is just a source of amusement for people like you." Graham opened his mouth to respond, but Robert held up a hand to stop him. "I'm done here, Graham. This interview is over. I won't sit here and be treated like a circus animal performing tricks for your amusement." Robert reached down and unclipped his microphone, the small device hitting the coffee table with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent studio. The audience watched in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's biggest stars prepared to walk off the set of Britain's most popular talk show. Graham made one final plea. "Robert, please don't leave like this. We can move on to other topics. We can talk about your new film, your upcoming projects." Robert paused at the edge of the stage, turning back to face Graham one last time. "You know what, Graham? Some things are more important than promoting a movie. Some things are more important than good television. Dignity is one of them. Respect is another. And you've shown me tonight that you understand neither." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Graham sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of shock and regret. The audience remained silent, unsure whether to applaud or simply sit in stunned disbelief. Robert adjusted his jacket and straightened his shoulders, reclaiming some of the composure that had made him a star. As Robert turned to leave, Graham made one final desperate attempt. "Robert, wait. Please, let me apologize properly. Let me make this right." But Robert didn't turn around. His voice carried clearly across the studio as he walked away. "Some things can't be made right with an apology, Graham. Some wounds run too deep." The cameras followed Robert as he strode toward the exit, his back straight and his head held high. The studio doors closed behind him with a finality that seemed to echo through the building. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. The weight of what had just happened settled over the studio like a heavy blanket. Graham sat motionless in his chair, his face drained of color, staring at the empty space where Robert had been just moments before. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, broken only by the mechanical whir of cameras still rolling and capturing every second of his humiliation. The audience remained frozen, their collective breath held as if any movement might shatter the fragile quiet that had settled over the studio like dust after an explosion. Finally, Graham cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. He looked down at his note cards, shuffling them with trembling fingers before setting them aside entirely. When he raised his eyes to face the camera, his usual sparkle was gone, replaced by something hollow and uncertain. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "that was not how this evening was supposed to unfold." The audience shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging worried glances while others pulled out their phones to capture the aftermath. Graham's hands fidgeted with his pen, clicking it repeatedly in a nervous rhythm that echoed through the studio speakers. He attempted his trademark smile, but it came out as more of a grimace, a pale imitation of the charisma that had made him Britain's most beloved talk show host. "I think," Graham continued, his voice gaining slight strength, "we've all witnessed something quite extraordinary tonight. Not extraordinary in the way we typically celebrate on this show, but extraordinary nonetheless." He paused, running a hand through his hair, disrupting his usually perfect styling. The gesture made him look younger somehow, more vulnerable than his audience had ever seen him. The production team huddled at the edge of the stage, whispering frantically among themselves. Some pointed toward the exit where Robert had disappeared, while others gestured at their watches, clearly concerned about filling the remaining airtime. Graham caught sight of their panic and held up a hand to signal that he would handle the situation, though his own composure remained visibly shaken. "You know," Graham said, turning back to the camera with effort, "in 30 years of doing this show, I've prided myself on finding the balance between entertainment and respect. Tonight, I fear I may have crossed a line that should never be crossed." His voice cracked slightly on the word never, and he paused to collect himself before continuing. The audience began to murmur softly, some nodding in agreement, while others looked confused by this sudden display of vulnerability from their usually unflappable host. Graham's eyes swept across the crowd, taking in their mixed reactions with the keen awareness of a performer who had spent decades reading rooms. "Robert Downey Jr. is, without question, one of the most talented actors of his generation," Graham continued, his words more measured now. "His journey, his struggles, his remarkable comeback, these are not subjects to be treated lightly or used as fodder for cheap laughs. And yet, that's exactly what I did tonight." The admission hung heavy in the air, a public confession that felt both necessary and painful. Graham stood up from his chair, pacing slightly behind his desk in a way that reminded everyone of Robert's earlier agitation. The parallel was not lost on the audience, who watched with rapt attention as their host grappled with the consequences of his words. "I've always believed that good television comes from pushing boundaries, from asking the questions that others might shy away from. But tonight taught me that there's a difference between challenging someone and attacking them." The cameras followed Graham's movements, capturing every gesture, every expression of regret that crossed his features. His usual polished presentation had given way to something more raw, more human. The studio lights seemed harsher now, casting deep shadows that emphasized the lines of stress around his eyes and mouth. "What troubles me most," Graham said, stopping his pacing to face the audience directly, "is not just that I hurt someone I genuinely admire, but that I may have damaged something much larger than this show or my own reputation. Recovery from addiction is sacred ground. It's not entertainment, it's survival. And I treated it as if it were just another topic to mine for laughs. What we witnessed tonight was television at its most brutal and most honest." Robert Downey Jr. didn't just walk off a stage, he walked away from the kind of entertainment that feeds on human pain for profit. Graham Norton learned that some boundaries, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. And we all learned that recovery isn't a punchline, it's a lifeline. What do you think? Did Graham cross the line, or was Robert being too sensitive? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more explosive celebrity confrontations that change television forever.